I'm really grateful for this invitation to talk to this group. The first thing you'll know is the title has changed. Apologies for that. But this is work in progress. It is based on Malmi's dissertation. Malmi is a young scholar at the University of Sydney who is definitely going places. Erwin and Marek were her advisors. And this is actually just one piece of Malmi's dissertation. I was really excited that they invited me to be part of this particular project because this really captures my imagination, and you will see why I think this is a really important piece. So as I present this work, I'm going to breeze through some of the empirical portions of it so that I can focus on our theoretical contributions. My specific sort of commitment is to computational theory construction. So as Neo pointed out, I enjoy the computational work. There are a lot of intricate computational moves in this, but I want to make sure that I'm able to communicate the underlying the theory that is under development. But if I miss explaining something critical, please do stop me because I would prefer to clarify as we go through, and then still leave some time at the tail end for discussion. Okay, so I can get this to work. So my interest has been, my long-term interest has been in digital innovation discourses. And this particular project looks at the innovation discourses that happen on Twitter. Now, when I talk about Twitter, using Twitter for political discourses, reviewers usually react pretty favorably. But when I've been talking about using Twitter in innovation discourses, I often get, how does it matter, who cares type of reaction. So let me start with some examples. What you see here is Y Combinator, a startup accelerator that has been on Twitter since 2010. And it has launched startups that you will know, like Airbnb, Stripe, Dropbox, Reddit, Instacart. It has posted over 20,000 times and has about 1.5 million followers, right? And it promotes a variety of different startups through its account. In the last year, there was also a lot of, last couple of years, there was also a lot of interest in this particular acquisition. Ben Tassel, the founder of MakerPad, which is a no-code learning community, in 2019, he tweeted about the tools that his members were using to create no-code projects. Airtable and Zapier were at the top of his list. And this inspired Walter Chen to tweet, one of them should buy MakerPad ASAP. That day, Wade Foster, Zapier's co-founder and CEO, reached out, and then within 6 months from that September 15 post, Zapier had acquired MakerPad. Another example is these venture capitalists having a conversation about moving from the West Coast to Miami. And instantly, Miami Mayor Francis Suarez reaches out to say, hey, how can I help? Right? So entrepreneurship researchers have taken Twitter discourses very seriously. And it makes sense that those of us in information systems or interested in technology discourses should do likewise. But when we look at the research on social bots, we see that there's quite a bit about Twitter bots. But looking across these, and not all of these are in information systems, they're in political science, communication, and by and large, they're focusing on political discourses, right? There is one recent exception, and that is work by Hani Safadi, John Lalor, and Nick Berente, who looked at bots across different subreddits. So these subreddits could be political content, cultural content, innovation. But Reddit is somewhat different from Twitter, right? Whereas Reddit is moderated and well regulated within the subreddits, Twitter is not. Reddit is also a fairly bounded set of communities, whereas Twitter is much more open. Bots on Reddit are typically self-identified. When they are not, they do tend to be identified, which is how Honey et al. Conducted the study. They are identified by other accounts. So their identity is fairly well known. And the amount of bots participating on the subreddits relative to Twitter is not nearly as extensive. So this is a somewhat different phenomenon, which really says what we need is to be looking at how these social bots are influencing these very important innovation discourses that occur on Twitter, right? So innovation discourses unfold quite a bit differently than political discourses. On the one hand, political discourses tend to be competitive, right? So you have somebody trying to win an election, trying to lobby for a particular point of view, a particular political agenda. So we have two-party elections, yes/no exit issues like Brexit. In contrast, innovation discourses, yes, they are competitive, but they're also mutualistic, oriented towards sharing knowledge, oriented towards collaborative learning. The time horizons for political discourses tend to be more fixed, right? So we have an election coming up or a referendum on which we need a vote, whereas innovation discourses tend to be much more open-ended, unfolding over long periods of time. The parameters being discussed are also relatively fixed for political discourses. One of two parties, one of maybe a dozen, but ultimately two or three candidates that constituencies might support. Two sides of a referendum issue. In contrast, the outcome space emerges through discourse, through innovation discourses, and tends to be fairly unlimited. This is not something we can specify in advance. So innovation discourses are fundamentally different from political discourses, and yet we don't really understand how bots operate in these innovation discourses or what their consequences are. So this is a phenomenon-driven, a data-driven theorizing effort. We are not testing theory. We're trying to derive theory from our data. And as is typical with such efforts, the research questions tend to evolve with the engagement with the empirical context. So we're still focusing we're still working on trying to focus our research questions to what we can best answer with our data. So this too has changed somewhat since the abstract that I shared. What we are interested in understanding first is, are social bots as prevalent in innovation discourses as we've seen them in political discourses? And if they are, can these digital innovation discourses survive, or as folks like Salji, like Kitchens have suggested that we're going to have a polarization of the discourse to where people perceive only one or the other perspective. And if social bots are able to help innovation discourses remain viable, how do they do that? Right? So this is really the focus of our investigation. Now, as we begin our work with social bots, we take stock of the literature on bots and we see, what are the perspectives represented? And we see three distinct perspectives. The first is sort of characterized in Baird and Mariping's MI's quarterly paper, where the focus is on delegation, right? So individuals, people delegate something to agentic AI, or in some cases, agentic AI delegates to a human. That perspective is sort of a bot and a dyad. It's a dyadic relationship between human and agent. The second perspective is represented in work by in Carolina's work, in Hani's work, and that's this idea of conduit brokerage. So theirs is very much a network perspective. You have a bot in a network. That network is established, is visible, is easy. I shouldn't say easy, but it is graspable, if you will, right? And this is typically one bot in relation to a multitude of human actors. And then the last perspective is just starting to come out. This was based on Leotal's work with the South Korea Druking scandal. And what they advanced was an agenda-setting theory of how bots behaved. Basically, they hijacked that particular discourse towards a political end, right? And they allude to, they don't necessarily develop this, but they allude to an ecosystem perspective. And this is the perspective that we find especially useful because it's not a single bot on Twitter that is relating to a multitude of human actors. It's more a many bots to many humans in sort of an open-ended ecosystem that is not the structure which is not pre-specified. Right? So we find this perspective to be really useful. And because they're focusing on agenda setting, they advance sort of an attention economy approach to theorizing the role of bots. Right? So the other ways in which these three perspectives differ. One of is an identification problem, which we definitely struggled with, and we have some extensive appendices to the paper as a consequence, because we certainly didn't have the kind of a priori knowledge of the bots as a bot and a dyad perspective might have, or the self-identification, crowdsourcing, funnel approach wasn't working particularly well for us. But we did a few different things that I will be happy to go into further detail or share information with you later on to address this identification problem. But what is really interesting is instead of focusing on autonomy and control or the movement of resources, our focal mechanism has to do with attention, right? So this is what we care about, the dynamics of attention in a discourse ecosystem. Now, in my previous work, in my 2022 paper on blockchain, we had highlighted three premises of an ecological perspective on discourse. The first is that ecosystems are hierarchically organized, and we borrowed from Ping Wang's ecosystems paper, also in MI's quarterly, and his exposition of holons, which he draws from systems theory. So a holon is nested within other holons and comprises holons. So imagine sort of a nesting of systems or nesting of circles, right? So the first thing is an ecological perspective speaks to hierarchical organization of organisms, of entities, right? These organisms and entities within the ecosystem are both autonomous and interdependent. So this was the second principle that we had advanced. They both compete for resources, but they also support each other. They are supportive of each other, they're symbiotic, they're mutualistic in their relationships with each other. For example, in discourse ecosystems, you see different types of actors learning vicariously from each other, supporting each other's learning within communities, developing shared repertoires. Right? So to these three principles, we add this idea of crowding and death, which comes out of the population ecology literature, that as spaces get to be overcrowded, entities are going to die off, right? But as these entities die off, niches start to form within the ecosystem and make room for renewal. So these are two additional principles that we build on in this investigation. And we put this together with literature on the attention ecology. So existing work that work on bots, on discourse ecosystems, typically tends to follow what is characterized as an attention economy framing, which follows work by, if you've read the book by Davenport and Beck, The Attention Economy, that is the mindset represented in most work from an attention perspective, right? So here, attention is a resource for which there is extensive competition, right? And this is exemplified by political and marketing campaigns. The temporality for attention, for the attention economy, is immediate, is near term. I want your attention, I want it now for a particular purpose. Either I want to sell you something or I want you to vote in a particular way, right? So it is near term. And the cause of attention is typically individualistic, factors such as your interest, your emotion, right? Whereas within an attention ecology perspective, and this goes back to people like Gregory Bateson and then more recently Yves Sutton, this allows for the generativity of attention. That attention is not a finite resource, but they actually characterize attention more as an environment, right? So there is a generativity, it allows for mutualism as opposed to simply competition. And this is very well suited to our investigation of innovation discourses. So in this perspective, in the attention ecology perspective, attention is not a zero-sum game. Okay, so these are our methods, and you'll see this gets pretty dense. We begin with the corpus of tweets about blockchain from Australian accounts between 2011 and 2017. We used the Botometer API to categorize accounts as bot or human with a lot of intermediate work. The next major computational move was structural topic modeling to surface discourse frames. We also extracted hypertext features like hashtags, accounts, URLs from tweets. We identified the domains underlying the URLs that were in the tweets. We performed some network analysis. And then a three-step theorizing process, right? So from that data, we iteratively theorized a set of discursive practices that I'll go through. The next thing we did was to look at, well, this discourse had varying levels of bottification, if you will. The proportion of contributions that came from bot accounts over time, so we could observe the composite consequences of bottification for the diversity and the volatility of those of the discourse. So we look at those aggregate consequences for diversity and volatility. And then we take a step back, we perform some thought trials, we go back to the literature and do a little bit of simulation to develop our theory. Okay, so first off, we identify the set of practices, discursive practices engaged by social bots. And in developing these practices, we go back to Feldman and Olkowski's definition of what constitutes a practice. And there's two parts to their definition. First, it is an activity, but there also has to be a consequence of that activity for itself, if you will. So we're looking for activity, we're looking for consequence before we characterized something as a practice. And the first practice we honed into was innovation spotlighting. Right? For all of our practices following Barney Glaser, we develop alternate indices, typically looking for two different metrics for each concept or each dimension of a concept that we work with. Okay, so the first thing we see is in the initial period, the initial year of that discourse, these Black tweets are coming from bot accounts. You'll see that all but one of these tweets actually came from bot accounts. So this is what clued us into this possibility of discourse sort of initializations, bringing attention to the discourse by bots. So after that, we start to look at this more systematically, and we see that there's a much higher rate of participation and contribution by bots early than later in this Australian blockchain discourse. Whoops. And then we also see that what they're doing is they're tagging other accounts and drawing them in, right? So we see a much higher incidence of mentions of other accounts that are not participating as authors in this Australian blockchain discourse, and a much higher out-degree centrality. And this is a dynamic that I had sort of pointed to in my 2015 social media paper, this dynamic of getting attention by giving attention. So by tagging people, by giving them attention, we're drawing them into this discourse. But then the next part was, does this have consequences for the discourse? And in fact, what we see is that both contributions as well as accounts referenced do increase participation by new accounts, right? So our first observation then, we formalize this as social bots engage in innovation spotlighting practices, which are discourse initialization and co-opting actors more than humans. Right? The second practice that we investigate is innovation focusing. And I'm going to scoot through some of those dimensions, but the long and the short of it is, if we look at this, bots tend to focus more of their attention on fewer frames or topics and fewer terms within frames, right? So this was really interesting. So again, we looked at this more systematically, and we find that the framing by bots tends to be much more focused, so fewer topics, and again, measured by a couple of different indices. And then also we see that the semantics is also more focused, right? So the terms that constitute those frames for bots tends to be fewer and more prevalent than for humans. Was this consequential? Yes. We see that changes frame use and frame focus subsequently, thereby leading us to say that, okay, this is also a practice, and social bots engage in this practice of innovation focusing which is framing focus and semantic focus, more than humans. The third practice we investigated was innovation warranting, and this had to do with the use of URLs. So if we look at these two tweets, the one on the left contains a URL to the BBC domain. The one on the right does not contain any URL. So just by virtue of looking at the real estate occupied by these tweets, the one on the left commands more attention. So we started to look at these URLs a little bit more closely. And of course, we found that bots shared URLs much more extensively than humans. And when we look at this in terms of the underlying domains, the pattern holds, right? And of course, this also has consequences for the subsequent focus of the framing within the discourse. So once again, we say, bots are engaging in these innovation warranting practices also more than humans. The last practice that we look at is innovation memorializing. And for this, we borrow from the political communication literature and, in fact, my own work on looking at hashtags as issue memorializing catchphrases to conceptualize this particular practice. Now, here are a couple of examples where the tweets are using hashtags to sort of memorialize, to make more evocative, give more traction to the underlying frames that are being communicated, right? So this is topic 5 or frame 5, if you will, cryptocurrency trading. And very quickly from the hashtags, I get this idea that this has to do with fintech, with cryptocurrency. And then topic 10 had to do with emerging technologies and situating blockchain within emerging technologies. And again, I see that very quickly from the hashtags, AI, machine learning, VR, IoT, and also blockchain. Right? So something interesting going on there too. And once again, we see bots engaging in hashtagging much more than human accounts. And they're also more focused in the hashtags that they deploy. And again, we found memorializing practices did have consequences for framing focus. So we conclude that this is also a practice and that social bots engage in these memorializing practices more than humans. So that was our first step. The second step is, okay, so we know that this is what bots are doing at the granular level. What are the consequences for the overall innovation discourse, right? So we developed this metric of discourse bottification, which is the proportion of tweets from bot accounts. And we look at two versions, if you will, of content variety. The first is diversity, and the second is volatility. Right? So diversity is very similar to framing focus that we've been talking about, sort of the inverse of framing focus. Volatility has to do, is over time. And instead of the Herfindahl index, we're using Kleinberg's verse to look at the changes in framing over time. Now, given what we've seen about bot practices and their consequences, this is not surprising that we would see less diversity as the level of botification increased, right? So the more the botification of the discourse, the lower the framing diversity. Now, if you read my previous work, I'm a big believer in framing diversity. So this is sort of cause for concern. I believe diversity is important. Any sort of cognitive diversity is important because it enriches a space. It allows for more innovation, greater generativity. So if we stopped here, the conversation would die. The discourse would die. We would have no more innovation discourses on Twitter. But we see something else. When we look at the relationship between bodification and the volatility of the discourse, so change over time, we see that as bodification increases, the volatility increases. And this was sort of a real aha moment for us. Okay, so we superimpose those two curves to say, okay, we're losing out on diversity, but we're gaining in volatility. So an observation, and these observations are sort of intermediate theorizing devices. An observation is that participation by social bots offsets the deficits in short-run framing diversity with long-run framing volatility. Right? So these are simply observations that are going to help us. They provide the building blocks for a theory, but we're not there yet. So our third step is to take a step back now and try and figure out how all of this comes together. Right? So the first thing that has to happen within a discourse is that it needs to be sourced. It needs to be constructed. Right? So how does this go about? How does this happen? So remember that an ecological perspective is hierarchical, right? So we have several different adjacent discourses and conversations, discourses being public, conversations being private. So all of these talks, if you will, are going on concurrently, right? So this discourse space is nested within other discourses. Hence, this idea of hierarchical organization is important. Right? Now, within this bot pulls information maybe from a private discourse and starts advancing a particular frame. And this seeds the focal discourse, right? So we've sourced this particular discourse from a private conversation. It could well have come from an AI discourse. It could have come from my personal experience. So if it was a human, it could have come from my experience with blockchain, or it could have come from the US blockchain discourse. But that discourse first needs to be sourced. And here we see it being sourced very similar to empirical evidence by a bot. Right? So what happens next? As the bot is sourcing this discourse, it's also tagging individuals from other discourses and drawing them into the space, right? So the discourse is seeded with content and it's seeded with actors, right? So the discourse is now constructed. So that's stage one of what the bot is accomplishing. So once the discourse is constructed, we have a variety of frames, and I'm going to background the actors for now, but we have a variety of frames. And this is where this principle of crowding and death comes in, right? As humans, we are able to pay attention to a variety of things. And we might say, hey, this blockchain frame, Australian blockchain frame 1, is similar to the US blockchain frame U2. And we might start to assemble that together. But ultimately, only a few of these frames are going to survive because we're reading across these discourses. We're not only paying attention to the Australian blockchain discourse, but we are paying attention to private conversations, these adjacent technology discourses, discourses within other countries, right? So this is where we did a little simulation to say, okay, so under high cognitive effort, we're going to retain only the predominant, the most prevalent Australian blockchain discourse frame, which is B1. And then in IoT, because I1, I2, and I3 all occur with comparable frequency, we retain all three of those, right? From the US blockchain discourse, we retain the two that are occurring most frequently, and so on and so forth. But with low cognitive effort, yes, we still retain B1 from the Australian blockchain discourse, but we completely lose we lose all of the frames from the IoT discourse, right? So if we are allocating a high level of effort, then moderately competing frames are going to survive. But if we are allocating less effort, then none of those frames survive, which means that this discourse is not sustainable. It starts to die off, right? So this is where, by focusing the discourse, these bots are actually enhancing the viability of the discourse. Okay, so what happens next? So in this first period, we see the predominant framing occurring around B1, but also frames B2, B3, and B4. And then, of course, because those are not as prevalent and because of bots focusing effects, frames B2, B3, and B4 die out for the moment, right? And some of that attention gravitates towards B1. But at the same time, there is this lacuna, there is this gap in the Australian blockchain discourse that creates a niche, right? And this is yet another principle of ecosystem from another ecological principle that I mentioned early on. So when this niche is created, what that does is to make room for either the reintroduction of another of a previously held frame, which was B2, but also maybe the introduction of a novel frame, right? So what is happening, and this is where volatility is really interesting, or the effects on volatility are really interesting. Yes, because of the focusing of a discourse, we see fewer frames survive from one period to the next. But then this opens up a niche, and it allows for those niches to be repopulated, either by bot accounts or by human accounts, right? So this is how bots contribute to the sustaining of innovation discourses, right? So this is a three-stage model that we are advancing of discourse construction, discourse consolidation, and then niche management, right? And discourse construction was the innovation spotlighting, attracting attention. Consolidation was focusing, warranting, memorializing to make sure that those important frames have people's attention, but then introducing variability over time, or allowing for that variability to be introduced over time through the creation and repopulation of niches. Right? So this is our major takeaway, this idea of niche management, if you will, that we think is super important with innovation discourses and bots. So really quickly, because I want to leave some time for discussion. What are we contributing? So to digital innovation discourses, we're saying that social bots are an actor that has not been recognized. It's been overlooked in research on digital innovation discourses, and we're drawing attention to this. We also developed this attention ecology perspective on digital innovation discourses that highlights both mutuality and competition and this idea of niche creation and repopulation by bots. Now, for social bots, I think it was really cool that we did this. How are we conceptualizing bots in general? Are they part of a dyad? Are they part of a network? Or are they part of this unstructured ecosystem, unstructured in terms of connections among people, unstructured in terms of of a priori meanings, right? And this is where we come down on, if we're looking at innovation discourses, we have to conceptualize of bots as present within ecosystems, right? We identify some practices, some discursive practices of bots within an ecosystem, and this idea of niche creation and repopulation, I think, is really cool. What are we missing? So our work is based on relatively primitive bots. And I'm sure we've all been reading of Moltbot and Moltbook recently in recent weeks. So the predominant perspective on bots is as actors, as agents that move information around. If you look at Carolina Salgi's work, it's primarily about moving information around, albeit with some embellishment of that information. You know, Bert says the certain path to feeling creative is to find a constituency more ignorant than yourself. So this is what we believe that bots do, right? This is the foundation for their conduit brokerage theory. I don't think this changes much with more intelligent or more prevalent bots. With more bots, practices will have similar consequences, I think, but maybe the effort frontier will change. So I want to do a little bit more work to try to anticipate what this effort frontier will look like. But one big change, so Schumpeter tells us that innovation is not just about exchange, it's also about recombination. And with the bots that we're seeing these days, recombination is definitely part of the equation. These agents are now able to not simply take and embellish and move information around, but they're able to actively recombine it. You know, we can tweak parameters such as temperature to increase the novelty of these recombinations. And this is something that our work does not really address. This is something that we really need to see theoretical extensions, sensitivity analysis on as we move forward. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Shaila, for that wonderful research.